The mahogany doors of Superior Courtroom 304 swung open, and Hazel Sterling walked in like a king inspecting his domain, a 24-year-old former runway model named Chloe draped over his tailored arm. He expected a swift, brutal slaughter. He expected his quiet, unassuming wife of 15 years to beg for a fraction of his $2 billion tech empire. But as Judge Harrison Croft slammed his gavel and adjusted his reading glasses to review the final corporate restructuring documents, the arrogant smirk on Hazel's face died. The judge wasn't stripping his wife of her assets. He was reading the ironclad proof that Beatrice Sterling already owned every single share. To understand the sheer magnitude of Hazel Sterling's hubris, one had to look at the glass and steel monolith that housed Sterling Innovations in the heart of Silicon Valley. Hazel was the poster boy for the modern tech billionaire. At 42, he possessed the rugged, perfectly manicured jawline of a man who spent as much time with his personal trainer as he did in boardrooms. He graced the covers of Wired, Forbes, and Time, always photographed in his signature charcoal turtlenecks, staring thoughtfully off camera as if visualizing the future. Hazel believed his own myth. He believed he was a self-made titan, a solitary genius who had willed a multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence logistics network into existence through sheer force of personality. And because he believed this, he fundamentally believed that he was outgrowing his past. That past included Beatrice. Beatrice Sterling was, in Hazel's eyes, a relic. They had met at MIT when they were both broke, eating instant ramen and sharing a cramped apartment in Cambridge. Over the last 15 years, as Hazel ascended to the stratosphere of global wealth, Beatrice had remained maddeningly grounded. She didn't want to attend the Met Gala. She preferred tending to her greenhouse. She abhorred designer logos, still drove a 5-year-old Volvo, and refused to play the role of the glittering trophy wife that Hazel's new peers paraded around. So, Hazel found an upgrade. Her name was Chloe Bennett. Chloe was a whirlwind of Instagram-filtered perfection, a woman whose entire existence revolved around luxury brands, yacht parties, and climbing the social ladder. Hazel's affair with Chloe hadn't been discreet. He had paraded her through the VIP sections of Monaco and St. Bart's, confident that Beatrice would quietly accept her humiliation, take a modest settlement, and fade into the background. "She's a mouse, David," Hazel laughed, leaning back in the plush leather chair of his penthouse office. He was swirling a glass of Macallan 25, his eyes fixed on his high-powered divorce attorney, David Kensington. Kensington was a notorious shark, a man whose hourly rate could buy a small car. "Mice can still chew through wires, Hazel," Kensington warned, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against a thick stack of legal briefs. "You've been married for 15 years. California is a community property state. Without an ironclad post-nuptial agreement, she is legally entitled to 50% of everything you've built." Hazel scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He turned to look at Chloe, who was sprawled on a velvet chaise lounge across the room, mindlessly scrolling through her phone while a manicurist painted her toes. "She won't fight," Hazel said with absolute certainty. "Beatrice doesn't have the stomach for it. Besides, the company's valuation is tied entirely to me. I am the CEO. I am the face, the visionary, the driving force. If she tries to take half, the board will panic, the stock will tank, and her half will be worthless. She knows that. Offer her $50 million, the house in Carmel, and let's be done with it. I want to marry Chloe by spring." Chloe looked up, her lips curving into a predatory smile. $50 million is generous, Ricky. Honestly, what is a woman like her going to do with more? Buy more potting soil? Hazel chuckled, walking over to kiss the top of Chloe's head. Exactly. Beatrice is simple. I'm the one who navigated the venture capital rounds. I'm the one who charmed the angel investors. I built Sterling Innovations from a garage to a global powerhouse. She just made the coffee. It was a lie, of course. A lie Hazel had repeated so often, with such conviction, that he had entirely rewritten his own history. He had convinced himself that Beatrice's endless nights, glowing in the blue light of a computer monitor, her frantic typing, her quiet corrections to his flawed business plans, were nothing more than the supportive duties of a dutiful wife. He had forgotten the cardinal rule of his own industry. The salesman gets the glory, but the coder holds the keys. As the court date approached, Hazel's confidence swelled into a toxic balloon of arrogance. He leaked stories to the press, framing the divorce as a necessary evolution for a visionary leader, constrained by a wife who couldn't keep up. He orchestrated a public relations campaign that painted Beatrice as financially illiterate, emotionally unstable, and greedy. He wanted to break her spirit before she even set foot in the courthouse, ensuring she would sign whatever lowball settlement Kensington pushed across the table. What Hazel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that Beatrice wasn't crying in her greenhouse. She was preparing for war. 30 miles away, in the quiet, heavily wooded suburb of Woodside, Beatrice's Sterling sat at a large oak dining table, entirely surrounded by bankers' boxes. She wore an oversized grey sweater, her dark hair tied back in a messy bun, a pair of thick-rimmed reading glasses perched on her nose. She did not look like the estranged wife of a billionaire. She looked like an auditor. Across from her sat Hathaway Pendleton. Hathaway was a man in his late 60s, wearing a tweed suit that had been out of fashion for 3 decades. He didn't have billboards on the highway like David Kensington. He didn't leak stories to TMZ. Hathaway Pendleton was an old-money estate and corporate lawyer, a man who navigated the labyrinthine laws of trusts and holding companies with lethal, silent precision. He offered $50 million, B, Hathaway said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He pushed the settlement document across the table with a look of mild disgust. And the Carmel property. Though reading the fine print, Kensington slipped in a clause that requires you to pay the property taxes from the settlement fund. Beatrice didn't even look at the document. She took a sip of her black tea, her eyes fixed on a framed photograph sitting on the mantel. It was a picture of her and Hazel, taken 14 years ago in their Cambridge apartment. Hazel was smiling broadly at the camera. Beatrice was looking at the laptop screen in front of them, her hands on the keyboard. $50 million, Beatrice repeated softly, tasting the words. For a company currently valued at $2.4 billion. It's an insult, Hathaway agreed. A strategic insult. They want you to feel small. I am small, Hathaway. That's why Hazel never noticed what I was doing. Beatrice took a deep breath, the memory of Hazel's betrayal still a sharp ache in her chest. She had known about Chloe long before Hazel paraded her in Monaco. Beatrice had seen the hotel receipts routed to a shadow account. She had smelled the foreign perfume. She had felt the cold, creeping distance in their marriage. But instead of confronting him, instead of screaming and throwing plates, Beatrice had retreated to her office. She had opened her laptop, bypassed the security protocols of Sterling Innovations, protocols she had personally written, and began to methodically audit her own life. Hazel had always been a brilliant talker. He could sell ice to a polar bear. But 15 years ago, when they first conceptualized the predictive AI that would become the backbone of Sterling Innovations, Hazel was a financial disaster. He had a string of failed startups, a ruined credit score, and a pending lawsuit from an angry former partner. When it came time to actually incorporate the new company and seek seed funding, investors had balked at Hazel's name on the primary ownership documents. It was Beatrice who had saved him. It was Beatrice who had taken the inheritance her grandfather left her, a modest but crucial $300,000, and used it as the seed capital. And because Hazel was too busy doing interviews, taking meetings and playing the role of the visionary founder, he had left the legal paperwork entirely to Beatrice. "Let's review the structure," Beatrice said, pulling a worn, blue-bound folder from the center of the table. "Just to ensure I haven't lost my mind." Hathaway smiled, a terrifying, predatory glimmer in his grandfatherly eyes. "You haven't lost your mind, B. You executed the most brilliant corporate maneuver I've seen in my 40-year career." He opened the folder. 12 years ago, when Sterling Innovations was formally incorporated in Delaware, it was not established as an independent entity. It was established as a wholly owned subsidiary of a holding company, the Aegis Trust. Beatrice traced the rim of her teacup. "And Hazel's status?" Hazel Sterling was granted the title of Chief Executive Officer. He was given a generous salary, corporate perks, and Class B non-voting shares. His contract explicitly states that his shares only vest upon the liquidation of the company or a unanimous vote by the board of the holding company. Hathaway tapped the paper. He signed this. 13 years ago, in a rush on his way to a tech summit in Austin, if my notes are correct. "He never read it," Beatrice said quietly. "He hates legalese. He told me to just handle the boring stuff so he could focus on the big picture." "Well, the big picture is quite clear," Hathaway said, leaning forward. "The Aegis Trust is the sole owner of Sterling Innovations' intellectual property, its patents, and 85% of its voting stock. And the sole trustee, sole beneficiary, and absolute controller of the Aegis Trust is Beatrice Sterling." Beatrice looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. For over a decade, she had let Hazel take the credit. She had loved him, and she wanted him to shine. She had built a fortress around him to protect him from his own reckless financial habits, legally isolating the company's core assets so that if Hazel ever got sued again, the company would survive. She had built the Aegis Trust out of love. Now, it was her weapon. "He thinks he's going to walk into court and strip me bare," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He thinks because he's on the magazine covers, he owns the ink." Hathaway closed the blue folder. "He is walking into a minefield, B, and he's doing it blindfolded." "Are we proceeding with the counter-filing?" Beatrice looked back at the photo on the mantel. She thought of Chloe Bennett's sneering face on Instagram, posing on the deck of a yacht bought with company funds. She thought of Hazel's cruel words to the press, calling her a stagnant burden. The sorrow in her chest crystallized, hardening into something cold, clear, and unbreakable. "Yes, Hathaway," Beatrice said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous resolve. "Let him put on his show. Let him bring his mistress to court. Let him strut. When the time comes, we will show the judge who actually holds the deed to the castle." The morning of the trial, the steps of the Foley Square Courthouse in New York looked like the red carpet of a Hollywood premiere. Hazel Sterling had orchestrated a media circus. Barricades held back dozens of paparazzi and reporters, their cameras flashing like strobe lights against the grey morning sky. At exactly 8:45 a.m., a sleek, black Maybach pulled up to the curb. The crowd surged forward as Hazel stepped out, looking every inch the conquering hero. He wore a bespoke navy Brioni suit that hugged his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He paused, turning back to the car to extend a hand. Chloe Bennett emerged, wearing a pristine white Chanel skirt suit that screamed new money and oversized Tom Ford sunglasses. She linked her arm through Hazel's, projecting the image of a supportive, deeply concerned partner. She smiled for the cameras, perfectly playing the role of the glamorous successor. "Hazel, Hazel, is it true Beatrice is demanding half the company?" a reporter shouted over the din. Hazel stopped, projecting a look of practiced, sorrowful gravitas. "It's a difficult time," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the microphones. "I've always wanted the best for Beatrice. I've offered her a very generous settlement to ensure she is comfortable for the rest of her life. But I cannot allow her to dismantle Sterling Innovations. I have a responsibility to my employees, my investors, and the future of AI. I built this company from the ground up, and I will protect it." He gave a final, solemn nod and strode up the courthouse steps, Chloe clinging to him like a shiny, expensive barnacle. 10 minutes later, a standard yellow cab pulled up at the far end of the street. Beatrice stepped out, paying the driver in cash. She wore a tailored, understated charcoal grey pantsuit, flat shoes and no jewellery, save for a vintage watch that had belonged to her grandfather. She carried a leather briefcase. Beside her walked Hathaway Pendleton, clutching his battered leather satchel. They slipped through a side entrance, entirely unnoticed by the press. Inside Superior Courtroom 304, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The air smelled of lemon polish and old wood. Hazel sat at the petitioner's table, radiating arrogance. He checked his Rolex, whispered a joke to Kensington, and chuckled softly. Chloe sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind him, crossing her long legs and sighing audibly, bored by the drab surroundings. When Beatrice entered and took her seat beside Hathaway, Hazel barely glanced at her. Kensington threw them a look of pure, predatory pity. "All rise," the bailiff barked. Judge Harrison Croft entered from chambers. He was a notoriously no-nonsense jurist, a man who had presided over complex corporate divorces for 20 years. He had no patience for theatrics. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and peered down at the enormous stack of filings before him. "Be seated," Judge Croft rumbled. "We are here for the matter of Sterling versus Sterling. I have reviewed the preliminary motions. Mr. Kensington, I assume your client is still pushing to invalidate the standard community property split based on the argument of sole extraordinary contribution." David Kensington stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. Our argument is straightforward. While California law generally dictates a 50-50 split, my client, Hazel Sterling, is the sole driving force behind the multi-billion-dollar valuation of Sterling Innovations. Mrs. Sterling's contributions to the marriage and the business were negligible. To award her 50% of the voting shares would destabilize a publicly traded— "Sterling Innovations is not publicly traded, Counselor," Hathaway Pendleton interrupted, not bothering to stand, his voice dry as dust. Kensington glared. "A privately held unicorn, excuse me. The point remains. My client is the founder, the CEO, the visionary. Giving half of his life's work to a woman who has not set foot in the corporate office in a decade is a travesty of equity. We have offered a $50 million cash buyout, which is more than fair." Judge Croft looked over his glasses at Beatrice's table. "Mr. Pendleton, your client rejected the $50 million settlement?" Hathaway stood up slowly, leaning on the defense table. "We did, Your Honor. We rejected it because my client does not wish to accept a settlement paid out of her own money." A ripple of confusion swept through the courtroom. Hazel frowned, leaning over to whisper to Kensington. "Her own money?" "Explain, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Croft said, leaning forward. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has spent a great deal of time, and apparently a great deal of PR money, painting my client as a passive housewife attempting to steal Mr. Sterling's company." Hathaway reached into his satchel and pulled out the thick, blue-bound folder. This narrative relies on a fundamental, frankly embarrassing, misunderstanding of the corporate structure of Sterling Innovations. Objection, Kensington snapped. Relevance. We are here to divide marital assets, not debate corporate tax structures. Overruled, Croft said sharply. I'm interested. Proceed, Mr. Pendleton. Hathaway walked slowly toward the center of the room. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling is laboring under the delusion that he owns Sterling Innovations. He does not. He is merely an employee. A highly compensated employee, to be sure, but an employee nonetheless. Hazel burst into laughter. It echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. He shook his head, looking at the judge as if Hathaway had just claimed the sky was green. Your Honor, this is absurd. I founded the company. I am the CEO. You are the CEO, Hathaway agreed pleasantly. But you are not the owner. Hathaway handed a copy of the blue folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Croft. He then handed a second copy to a suddenly pale David Kensington. Your Honor, if you look at Exhibit A, you will find the original incorporation documents filed in Delaware 13 years ago. Sterling Innovations is a wholly owned subsidiary. 100% of the intellectual property, the patents, including the core predictive AI algorithm, written entirely by Beatrice Sterling, not her husband. And 85% of the voting shares are held by a parent company. Hazel's laughter abruptly ceased. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of his neck. He looked at Beatrice. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the judge. The parent company, Hathaway continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room, is the Aegis Trust, a holding company formed legally and independently. And if you turn to page 42 of that document, Mr. Kensington, you will see the signature of the sole trustee, sole manager, and sole owner of the Aegis Trust. Kensington frantically flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His hands began to shake slightly. He found page 42. He stared at the signature. Well, Mr. Kensington, Judge Croft asked, having already found the page himself. Kensington swallowed hard, looking at Hazel with a mixture of horror and fury. Your Honor, the signature is Beatrice Sterling's. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by a sharp gasp from Chloe in the gallery. Hazel leaped to his feet, his face flushing crimson. That's a forgery. It's a lie. I own this company. I built it. She's trying to steal my life. Mr. Sterling, sit down, Judge Croft roared, slamming his gavel. Hathaway Pendleton didn't even blink. He simply turned to Hazel, his expression one of polite, lethal calm. There is no forgery, Mr. Sterling. You signed the employment contract acknowledging this structure 13 years ago. Your signature is on page 45, right beneath the clause that states you hold non-voting Class B shares, which can be revoked at any time by the holding company. Hathaway turned back to the judge. Your Honor, Beatrice Sterling isn't here to ask for half of Hazel Sterling's company. She is here to terminate his employment from hers. Mr. Sterling, sit down, Judge Croft roared, slamming his gavel so hard the sound cracked like a rifle shot across the panelled room. One more outburst like that and I will hold you in contempt. Sit down. Hazel fell back into his chair, as if the wind had been violently knocked out of him. His chest heaved beneath the bespoke Brioni suit. He stared wildly at David Kensington, waiting for his high-priced shark to do something, to object, to tear this absurd fairy tale to shreds. But Kensington was frozen. The famously ruthless attorney was staring at the signature on page 45 of the incorporation documents, a bead of cold sweat tracing the line of his jaw. "David!" Hazel hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "Do something. Tell him it's a clerical error. Tell him the holding company is a shell." Kensington slowly turned his head. The look in his eyes wasn't pity anymore. It was the look of a man realizing he had just steered a multi-million-dollar legal team straight off a cliff. "Hazel," Kensington whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs erupting from the gallery. "This is your signature. You acknowledged the Aegis Trust as the parent company. You acknowledged your status as an at-will employee of that trust. You signed away your voting rights 13 years ago." "I didn't read it," Hazel hissed back, his face a blotchy crimson. "I was boarding a flight to Austin for the SXSW pitch. I told her to handle the incorporation. She tricked me." "Ignorance of a contract you signed is not a legal defense in the state of New York, nor in Delaware where this was filed," Kensington replied, his tone turning icy as he sought to distance himself from his client's catastrophic negligence. At the defense table, Beatrice sat perfectly still. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She watched Hazel with the detached, analytical gaze of an engineer observing a failing system. "Your Honor," Kensington stammered, standing up. He tugged at his collar, his usual courtroom swagger entirely evaporated. "Even if, and I say if, this document holds up to forensic scrutiny, my client's sweat equity is undeniable. Hazel Sterling built the valuation of Sterling Innovations. He secured the venture capital. He secured the enterprise contracts with the Department of Defense. His face, his brand, his labor are the sole reasons this company is worth $2.4 billion. To suggest Mrs. Sterling can simply seize his life's work based on a 13-year-old technicality violates the very spirit of marital equity." Hathaway Pendleton chuckled. It was a dry, rasping sound, like sandpaper on wood. He stood up, adjusting his vintage spectacles. "Sweat equity, Your Honor?" Hathaway asked mildly. "Mr. Kensington speaks of venture capital. Let us address that." Hathaway reached into his satchel and pulled out a second, thinner folder. Sterling Innovations did not receive outside venture capital until its Series A funding round, 3 years after incorporation. The initial seed funding, the money used to secure server space, hire the first 5 developers, and keep the lights on, came entirely from Beatrice Sterling's personal inheritance, a sum of $312,000 explicitly deposited into the Aegis Trust. Hathaway passed the bank records to the bailiff. "Furthermore, Mr. Kensington speaks of the company's value. The core product of Sterling Innovations is the Archangel predictive logistics algorithm. It is the proprietary software that secured the very Department of Defense contracts opposing counsel just boasted about." Hathaway turned to look directly at Hazel. "Mr. Sterling, do you know how to code in Python or C++? Hazel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I didn't think so," Hathaway continued seamlessly. "Beatrice Sterling holds the sole patent for the Archangel algorithm. She wrote it. She debugged it. She licensed it exclusively to Sterling Innovations through the Aegis Trust. Mr. Sterling was a salesman, a very effective, very well-compensated salesman who has taken home over $80 million in salary and bonuses over the last decade. He has been more than fairly compensated for his sweat equity." In the front row of the gallery, Chloe Bennett's jaw had practically unhinged. The Tom Ford sunglasses had slipped down her nose. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her in real time. She had attached herself to a billionaire titan only to discover she was actually dating a glorified, highly paid middle manager who was about to be fired by his own wife. Judge Croft took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the documents, then at Beatrice, and finally at Hazel. "Mr. Kensington," Judge Croft said heavily, "your motion to deny a 50-50 split based on your client's sole extraordinary contribution is not only denied, it is practically comical. From the evidence presented, it appears Mr. Sterling does not own the assets in question to begin with. The judge banged his gavel. I am granting an immediate injunction protecting the assets of the Aegis Trust. Mr. Sterling, you are legally barred from making any unilateral financial decisions regarding Sterling Innovations, liquidating any company assets, or executing corporate contracts without the express, written consent of the majority shareholder, which, according to these very legally binding documents, is your wife. We will reconvene in 48 hours to discuss the division of the actual marital assets, which appear to be limited to Mr. Sterling's personal bank accounts and the real estate purchased with his salary. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, Hazel sat paralyzed. His empire, his identity, his entire reality had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes. He looked back at Chloe, desperate for an anchor, but she was already standing up, aggressively typing on her phone, her face a mask of furious calculation as she backed away from the railing. The ride back to the Sterling Innovations headquarters in Silicon Valley the next morning was a suffocating nightmare for Hazel. The press had already gotten wind of the disastrous hearing. The headlines on his tablet screamed in bold, mocking letters, "The billion-dollar bluff. Tech titan Hazel Sterling exposed as wife's employee." Hazel's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Investors were panicking. The public relations team was in absolute meltdown. But Hazel, running on pure frantic adrenaline, had a plan. He was still the CEO. He still had loyalists. He immediately called an emergency meeting of the Sterling Innovations Board of Directors. At 2 p.m., Hazel burst through the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom on the 50th floor. The room offered a panoramic view of the Bay Area, a visual reminder of the empire he believed he commanded. Gathered around the massive marble table were the heavyweights of the tech world. Bradley Stanton, the lead investor from a top-tier venture firm, Victoria Hughes, a ruthless private equity manager, and 3 other executives Hazel had personally handpicked. "Listen to me, all of you," Hazel said, not bothering to sit down. He paced at the head of the table, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. "The media is blowing this out of proportion. It's a legal technicality, a legacy structural flaw from when we incorporated. My divorce lawyers are filing an appeal to pierce the corporate veil of the Aegis Trust. But right now, I need a unanimous vote of confidence from this board to issue a press release stating that leadership remains unchanged and that Beatrice Sterling has no operational control over this company." Bradley Stanton, a silver-haired man who didn't tolerate fools, leaned back in his leather chair. He looked at Hazel with a cold, terrifying neutrality. "A technicality, Hazel. The legal department spent the entire night reviewing the Aegis Trust documents Hathaway Pendleton provided. They are airtight. You don't own the patent to Archangel, which means we don't own the patent. We license it from your wife." "She's a housewife," Hazel shouted, slamming his hand on the marble table. "She hasn't written a line of code in years. I am the one who made you all rich. I need a vote to dilute the Aegis Trust shares. We issue new Class A voting stock, dilute her holdings to under 50%, and I retain control." Victoria Hughes let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Dilute her shares? Hazel, did you actually read your own corporate charter? The Aegis Trust holds 85% of the voting power. We can't dilute her without a majority vote. And she is the majority." "She won't know how to stop us," Hazel insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She doesn't understand board maneuvers. She's probably at home crying to her lawyers." The heavy oak door at the back of the boardroom clicked open. "Actually, Hazel, I'm right here." The room went dead silent. Beatrice Sterling walked in. She was no longer wearing the understated grey suit from the courthouse. She wore a sharp, tailored navy blazer, her posture impeccable, her expression utterly unreadable. Flanking her were Hathaway Pendleton and two formidable-looking corporate security guards. Hazel froze, the color draining from his face. "What are you doing here? You aren't authorized to be on this floor." "I am the majority shareholder of Sterling Innovations, Hazel," Beatrice said smoothly, walking toward the head of the table. "I am authorized to be wherever I please. Furthermore, as the sole trustee of the Aegis Trust, I am legally entitled to call a sudden shareholder meeting, which I am doing right now." Beatrice didn't look at Hazel. She looked directly at Bradley Stanton and Victoria Hughes. "Good afternoon, Bradley. Victoria," Beatrice said, taking the seat opposite Hazel. "I apologize for the turbulence over the last 24 hours, but I am here to stabilize the situation." "Beatrice," Bradley said carefully, his tone respectful, "this is a highly irregular situation. The board is concerned about the leadership and direction of the company." "As you should be," Beatrice agreed, opening her briefcase. "For the last 5 years, I have watched Hazel prioritize PR stunts, vanity projects, and lavish personal expenses over the core development of the Archangel algorithm. He has used company funds to lease yachts, buy penthouses, and fund a lifestyle that has nothing to do with artificial intelligence logistics." "That's a lie," Hazel spat, stepping toward her. The two security guards immediately stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. Hazel stopped, breathing heavily. "It is all thoroughly documented," Beatrice said, handing a thick dossier to Victoria Hughes. "Forensic accounting of the discretionary executive accounts. It's embarrassing, frankly. But it ends today." Beatrice stood up. The quiet, unassuming woman Hazel had dismissed for over a decade was gone. In her place stood the true architect of the empire. "As the holder of 85% of the voting shares, I am exercising my right to immediately restructure the board," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am retaining Mr. Stanton and Ms. Hughes, as your firms provided the necessary Series A scaling capital. The remaining 3 seats, filled by Hazel's personal friends, are hereby vacated." The 3 hand-picked executives looked at Hazel in shock, then quickly began gathering their things. They knew better than to fight a legal landslide. "And finally," Beatrice said, turning her gaze to Hazel for the first time since she entered the room. Her eyes were like chips of flint. "As the newly restructured board, I am calling a vote to terminate the employment contract of the Chief Executive Officer, Hazel Sterling, effective immediately, for gross negligence, misuse of company funds, and violation of the morality clause in his contract." Hazel's legs gave out. He collapsed into a chair, his mouth hanging open. "You can't do this. You can't fire me. I am Sterling Innovations." "I vote yes," Victoria Hughes said, without a second's hesitation, eager to align herself with the actual power in the room. "I vote yes," Bradley Stanton echoed, closing the dossier. "And I vote yes," Beatrice finished. She looked at the 2 security guards. "Gentlemen, Mr. Sterling's employment has been terminated. Please escort him to his office to collect his personal effects, confiscate his keycards and company devices, and escort him off my property." The walk from the 50th floor executive boardroom to the ground floor lobby of Sterling Innovations took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. For Hazel Sterling, it felt like a funeral march through purgatory. Flanked by the 2 imposing security guards, Hazel carried nothing but a cardboard banker's box containing a customized platinum paperweight, a framed photo of himself shaking hands with a senator, and a half-empty bottle of Macallan. His corporate phone, his encrypted laptop, and his Platinum Company credit cards had been confiscated by the HR director, who had looked at him not with pity, but with an icy, practiced detachment. As he walked past the glass-walled open-plan workspaces, the typing stopped. Hundreds of developers, engineers and project managers, people who had previously scrambled to appear busy the moment his brioni-clad figure appeared, now simply stared. There were no hushed murmurs of respect. There were only wide eyes and the frantic, silent exchange of Slack messages. The news of the board's unanimous vote had already permeated the company's internal network. "Keep moving, Mr. Sterling," the lead guard murmured, his hand hovering near Hazel's elbow as they approached the main glass rotunda. Hazel's chest tightened. He could see the flashbulbs erupting beyond the glass doors. The press had multiplied. Word had leaked from the courthouse, and now the Silicon Valley paparazzi were hungry for the final act of the tragedy. He stumbled out into the blinding California sun. The barrage of questions was deafening. "Hazel, is it true you've been ousted?" "Mr. Sterling, what is your net worth now that your wife controls the Aegis Trust?" "Hazel, are you facing criminal charges for embezzlement?" He ducked his head, shoving his way through the throng toward his waiting Maybach. He yanked the heavy door open and collapsed into the leather seat, gasping for air. "Drive," he barked at his chauffeur, Thomas. "Just drive. Get me out of here." The car pulled away, leaving the architectural monument to his ego in the rearview mirror. Hazel reached for his personal phone with trembling hands. He needed a lifeline. He needed his lawyer to tell him this was a nightmare that could be undone. He dialed David Kensington. It went straight to voicemail. He dialed again. On the third try, an assistant answered. "Kensington Law, how may I direct your call?" "Put David on the line, now. It's Hazel Sterling." There was a brief pause, followed by the slick, unbothered voice of his former bulldog. "Hazel, I saw the Bloomberg alert. I advise you not to speak to the press." "David, you have to file an injunction. They just fired me. Beatrice orchestrated a boardroom coup. We have to sue the board, sue the trust, sue everyone." Kensington sighed, the sound of a man dealing with an exhausted credit limit. "Hazel, with what money?" The question hit Hazel like a physical blow. "What do you mean? I have millions in my personal accounts." "You have approximately 12 million in liquid assets, Hazel," Kensington corrected smoothly. "The rest of your perceived wealth was tied to your unvested Class B shares, which the board just legally nullified upon your termination for cause. Your real estate portfolio in Carmel and Malibu carries heavy mortgages paid directly by the company's executive compensation package, which no longer exists. My firm requires a $10 million retainer to initiate a hostile corporate takeover lawsuit of this magnitude. And frankly, Hathaway Pendleton has bulletproofed that trust. You would lose. I am formally dropping you as a client. I will send the final invoice for the courthouse appearance to your home. Good luck, Hazel." The line went dead. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Hazel's veins. He was not a billionaire. He was merely a multimillionaire with a burn rate that would bankrupt him in 6 months. He frantically dialed Chloe. The phone rang and rang and rang. When the Maybach finally pulled up to the gated driveway of his rented Silicon Valley mansion, Hazel found the front door wide open. He sprinted inside, calling her name. "Chloe, Chloe, pack your bags! We're going to St. Bart's until this blows over." The house was eerily silent. He ran up the floating glass staircase to the master suite. The massive walk-in closets, previously overflowing with Chloe's designer gowns, Birkin bags and Louboutins, had been entirely gutted. Only bare wooden hangers remained, swaying gently in the draught. On the marble kitchen island downstairs, he found a single, manicured post-it note stuck to a bottle of sparkling water. "Ricky. Saw the news. I can't be tied to a sinking ship. The PR would ruin my brand. Don't call me. See Hazel Sterling, the titan of industry, The visionary who had graced the cover of time sank to the cold marble floor of his empty mansion, entirely alone. Here is the rewritten and expanded Part 7, crafted to deliver the final twists and dramatic weight of the story within your requested length. 8 months had passed since the mahogany doors of Superior Courtroom 304 had slammed shut on Hazel Sterling's delusions of grandeur. In the unforgiving, hyper-competitive ecosystem of Silicon Valley, 8 months was an eternity, enough time for a hollow empire to completely collapse, and just enough time for its true architect to rebuild it from the foundation up. At the Sterling Innovations campus in Palo Alto, the corporate atmosphere had undergone a violent, seismic shift. Gone were the fleet of leased executive Maybachs, the mandated organic juice bars, and the suffocating public relations teams that used to trail Hazel like remoras attached to a dying shark. The company had violently returned to its roots. The sprawling, opulent executive suite on the 50th floor, once a dedicated monument to Hazel's massive ego, had been ruthlessly gutted and converted into a massive, open-air server testing laboratory. Beatrice Sterling did not operate from a corner office with panoramic views of the bay. She worked from a heavily fortified, climate-controlled bunker on the ground floor, entirely surrounded by her senior engineering team. In her first week, as the undisputed CEO and majority shareholder, she had fired the bloated marketing department and redirected $150 million, funds previously earmarked by Hazel for vanity sponsorships at European Formula One races, directly into the research and development of the company's core neural networks. The financial world had initially panicked at the sudden regime change. Pundits on CNBC had loudly predicted a catastrophic collapse, dismissing Beatrice as an emotional, vindictive ex-wife playing at business. But then, the quarterly earnings reports were published. Without Hazel's astronomical personal burn rate and his series of disastrous, flashy side investments, Sterling Innovations was suddenly sitting on a mountain of liquid capital. Prominent venture capital firms, including heavyweights like Sequoia Capital and Andreessen Horowitz, who had previously only tolerated Hazel's antics because the stock was climbing, were now aggressively clamoring for closed-door meetings with Beatrice. Famed tech journalist Kara Swisher had been the first to secure a rare, exclusive sit-down with the elusive new chief executive. In a devastatingly sharp and viral piece for New York Magazine, Swisher wrote, "For over a decade, the tech industry worshipped at the altar of Hazel Sterling, the charismatic, jawline-blessed frontman who sold us the future. But we were foolishly applauding the wooden puppet while entirely ignoring the puppeteer in the shadows. Beatrice Sterling isn't just the scorned widow of a living man's career. She is the undisputed heavyweight champion of predictive artificial intelligence. She doesn't pitch, she codes, and the industry is finally waking up to the terrifying reality that she holds all the cards." The true, undeniable test of Beatrice's public reign came on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, inside the cavernous, echoing halls of the Moscone Center in San Francisco. It was the annual Global Logistics and Artificial Intelligence Summit. Traditionally, this was Hazel's favorite playground. He would strut across this very stage wearing a $5,000 charcoal turtleneck, waving his hands and speaking in broad, empty platitudes about synergy and disruption, while expensive pyrotechnics fired in the background. Today there were no pyrotechnics. The massive auditorium was packed to absolute capacity. 5,000 developers, defense contractors, and high-level financial analysts sat in hushed, incredibly tense anticipation. Backstage, amidst the chaos of running cables and panicked event coordinators, Beatrice stood completely still, calmly sipping a cup of plain black tea. She wore a tailored, understated slate-grey blazer, dark denim trousers, and the exact same vintage leather-banded watch she had worn during the divorce trial. Beside her stood Hathaway Pendleton, the elderly corporate lawyer, looking entirely out of place amidst the frantic stage managers, clutching his battered leather satchel to his chest. "The entire board of directors is watching, B," Hathaway murmured, his gravelly voice cutting through the backstage noise. Bradley Stanton and Victoria Hughes are sitting dead center in the front row. They are expecting a miracle today to justify the complete restructuring of the board. Beatrice adjusted her thick-rimmed reading glasses, her expression an impenetrable, unbothered mask of quiet confidence. "I don't deal in miracles, Hathaway. I deal in applied mathematics. Hazel spent the last 5 years trying to teach a machine how to guess. I spent the last 10 years teaching it how to know." A stage manager wearing a heavy headset rushed over, looking slightly terrified of the quiet woman who had single-handedly decapitated a titan of industry. "Mrs. Sterling, you have exactly 2 minutes until you are live broadcasted." "Thank you," Beatrice said. She handed her empty teacup to Hathaway. She didn't check her reflection in a mirror. She didn't take a deep, theatrical, centering breath. She simply turned and walked toward the heavy black velvet curtains. As Beatrice stepped out into the blinding, brilliant spotlight, the applause that greeted her was not the manufactured, sycophantic roaring that used to follow Hazel. It was a dense, heavy and respectful applause, the distinct sound of a trillion-dollar industry holding its collective breath, desperate to see if the wild rumors of her genius were actually true. The massive LED screen behind her, illuminated with a single unadorned logo, Archangel 2.0, the deterministic engine. Beatrice walked to the center of the stage. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice to an artificial, motivational crescendo. She spoke with the cool, lethal precision of a master surgeon standing over an operating table. "For the past 15 years, you were told that Sterling Innovations was building a predictive model," Beatrice began, her voice echoing clearly and firmly through the massive hall. "You were sold a narrative of probability. You were told that our algorithms could guess the most efficient global shipping routes or anticipate supply chain disruptions with an 80% accuracy rate, and for a very long time, the global market accepted that 80% was the absolute ceiling of artificial intelligence." She clicked a small remote in her right hand. The screen behind her instantly shattered into a million cascading, brilliant lines of raw, incredibly complex Python and C++ code. The sheer density and elegance of the architecture drew audible, genuine gasps from the senior engineers seated in the front rows. "I am here today to tell you that probability is for gamblers," Beatrice said, her sharp eyes scanning the sea of faces. "And I do not gamble with my company, nor with your infrastructure. What you are looking at is the foundation of Archangel 2.0. We have entirely moved beyond predictive modeling and stepped into deterministic routing. By integrating a proprietary neural mesh that I have personally spent the last 80 months compiling in a secure, offline environment, Archangel 2.0 does not guess. It calculates. It instantly processes global weather patterns, geopolitical instability matrices, and microeconomic shifts in real time. It doesn't offer you a likely outcome. It mathematically guarantees you the only viable outcome." For the next 90 minutes, Beatrice delivered a brutal, brilliant masterclass. She completely abandoned flashy graphics and hollow marketing speak. She opened up the hood of the most advanced AI engine on the planet and meticulously walked the audience through the engine block. She cited complex data structures, algorithmic efficiencies, and hardware-software integration protocols that left the audience utterly spellbound. She demonstrated how the newly launched system, currently being stress-tested by the Department of Defense, had successfully rerouted naval supply chains during a simulated global crisis with a 0% failure rate. She wasn't standing there selling a shiny new product. She was establishing a new law of physics for the technological world. When she finally concluded her presentation, dropping the remote to her side, there was a stunned, heavy silence that stretched for 5 impossibly long seconds. And then the room completely exploded. It wasn't just applause, it was a frantic standing ovation driven by pure, unadulterated professional awe. Bradley Stanton and Victoria Hughes were on their feet, their faces flushed with the dizzying realization that their massive investment had just quadrupled in value in the span of an hour. Beatrice stood at the exact center of the stage, acknowledging the deafening roar with a polite, measured nod. She had not just stepped out of Hazel's shadow, she had entirely, permanently eclipsed his son. 900 miles away, in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a nondescript, dusty suburb of Henderson, Nevada, Hazel Sterling sat on a beige, synthetic leather sofa that smelled faintly of cardboard and stale regret. The brutal desert sun baked the cracked asphalt outside his small window. He was wearing a faded, stained grey t-shirt and loose sweatpants, the bespoke Brioni suits that used to define his silhouette and project his power were currently sitting in a rented, climate-controlled storage unit across town, slowly gathering dust. The $50 million settlement Beatrice had graciously, almost pityingly, allowed him to keep had evaporated with terrifying speed. Between paying off the massive underwater mortgages on the Carmel and Malibu properties he was legally forced to liquidate, settling the exorbitant debts of his former high-end lifestyle, and the sheer, crushing reality of capital gains taxes, Hazel found himself living on a strict, terrifyingly normal and rapidly dwindling budget. On the cheap flat-screen television, precariously mounted to his wall, the CNBC live stream of the Moscone Center keynote was playing loudly. Hazel stared at the screen, his eyes bloodshot, a half-empty bottle of cheap, generic bourbon resting on the scratched coffee table in front of him. He watched Beatrice effortlessly command the stage. He watched the lines of code, the very code he had once cruelly dismissed to his mistress as boring janitorial work, scroll behind his ex-wife like a digital tapestry. He watched the brilliant, powerful investors who used to return his calls within seconds, now standing and applauding the quiet woman he had arrogantly tried to discard like yesterday's trash. He slowly picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, a graveyard of burned bridges. There was no Chloe. She had entirely vanished into the Mediterranean the exact moment his platinum credit cards had been declined by a hotel in Monaco, seamlessly attaching herself to a young crypto-billionaire who actually possessed the liquid funds to support her extravagant, parasitic existence. He scrolled past David Kensington's number, his stomach twisting as he remembered the blistering, $1 million final invoice the ruthless lawyer had sent him. He scrolled past the elite journalists who used to beg him for exclusive quotes, all of whom had subsequently blocked his number when he desperately tried to pitch them a vindictive, tell-all book about his marriage. No publisher wanted a whining tell-all from the man who was foolishly tricked out of his own company. They only wanted to hear from the absolute genius who had orchestrated the flawless trick. Hazel took a long swig straight from the bourbon bottle, the cheap alcohol burning a harsh trail down his throat. He had spent his entire adult life meticulously crafting an illusion of greatness. He had firmly believed that if he stood in front of enough flashing cameras, if he wore the right designer clothes, and if he spoke with enough manufactured, booming confidence, he could literally alter reality itself to suit his ego. But reality, as Beatrice had just coldly proven to the entire world, was deterministic. It was built on hard, unyielding data, relentless competence, and undeniable truth. Hazel dropped his head into his hands. He was a salesman with absolutely nothing left to sell. Not even himself. Back in San Francisco, Beatrice exited the Moscone Center through a secure, heavily guarded underground loading dock. The frantic press was aggressively swarming the main glass entrances above, desperate for a singular soundbite, but Beatrice had absolutely no interest in indulging them. She had too much work to do. Hathaway Pendleton was waiting patiently by the open door of a modest, unmarked black town car. "A spectacular, undeniable success, B," Hathaway said, allowing himself a rare, genuine smile as she approached the vehicle. "The board is ecstatic. The stock is already up 32% in after-hours trading. You've completely secured the empire." Beatrice paused for a brief moment before getting into the car. She looked up at the towering, steel and glass skyscrapers of the city, their facades brilliantly reflecting the fading golden light of the California evening. She thought briefly of the arrogant, foolish man who had once confidently strutted into a courtroom, expecting to humiliate her and strip her of her dignity. A man who had been so entirely blinded by his own reflection that he hadn't noticed the glass was about to shatter and cut him to ribbons. "I didn't do this for the empire, Hathaway," Beatrice said softly, the cool evening breeze gently catching the collar of her blazer. "I did it because the code required it, and I never leave a project unfinished." She stepped into the quiet, leather-scented sanctuary of the car. The heavy door closed behind her with a solid, definitive thud, leaving the noise, the drama, and the pathetic ghosts of the past entirely behind. The saga of Hazel and Beatrice Sterling serves as a masterclass in the dangers of hubris and the lethal quiet of underestimated brilliance. Hazel's downfall was not merely a product of legal maneuvering, it was the inevitable collapse of an empire built entirely on outsourced intellect and unchecked narcissism. He mistook the spotlight for the power source, forgetting that the foundation of his wealth was forged by the very woman he sought to discard. Beatrice's triumph is a testament to strategic patience and undeniable competence. She did not need to be the loudest voice in the room to hold the most authority. She simply needed to hold the keys to the kingdom she built. Ultimately, the courtroom drama unmasked the ultimate modern truth. The illusion of power shatters easily, but genuine substance, like ironclad code and a brilliantly executed trust, remains unbreakable.